Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Amy Ziegert. I'm a senior fellow at CSAC and at the Hoover Institution. And I'm also one of the co-instructors of this terrific CSAC Honors Seminar. On behalf of my partners in instructional crime, Professor Rod Ewing and Dr. Esfandiar Mir, I want to welcome everybody to our fourth and final installment of Honors Thesis presentations. Now, I know we have CSAC faculty, we have fellows, we have alumni, and of course we have our student, family, and friends. So welcome everybody today. As for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're trying to keep a classroom feel. So everybody you see on the screen is a member of our class or a faculty advisor to somebody in the class. We're going to have three presenters today, and we're going to go right from one presentation to the next. Each student is going to speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A and discussion in the class. Dr. Mir has an old-fashioned stop sign, so students, you know, if you're getting close to the end of your time, he'll hold it up just like that. So we're high-tech and old school at the same time. As is our custom, the faculty advisor will be invited to ask the first question in our Q&A. Then we'll go to other faculty and students in the class, and then we'll open it up to all of you who are watching. If you would like to ask a question, you can do so at any time by using the two functions at the bottom of your Zoom screen. One is helpfully labeled Q&A, so you just tap on the Q&A tab and you can type in your question and we'll see it. The other way to do that is just to type in your question in the chat function, also in the bottom of your screen. For those of you in the classroom, of course, you can raise your physical hand or just click on your raise hand icon. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Our first presenter today is Bryan Metzger. Bryan is majoring in international relations and he's minoring in Arabic. He is from where he is sheltering in place right now, his hometown in Albuquerque, New Mexico. At Stanford, among his activities, he was one of those student vice chairs for Stanford in government. After graduation, Bryan will be pursuing a master's degree co-term in journalism at the Stanford Department of Communication. And his thesis advisor is Dr. Colin Call. Bryan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ziegert, for your introduction. Let me just set up my slides here. All right, we good to go?
We're good.
All right, thank you. My project, which I've been carrying out for the better part of a year now, examines the phenomenon of foreign influence through the lens of the 5-year policy debate within the United States around the JCPOA, more colloquially known as the Iran nuclear deal. And there's a perception in today's day and age within American politics that foreign countries possess significant power to influence political decision-making in the US, and that powerful lobbies and interest groups aligned with these countries exist to sway policy one way or another. And the questions raised by such perceptions ultimately provided the motivating drive for my thesis as I sought to develop a better understanding, both for myself and for the wider community, of foreign influence and to see what we might be able to say about its efficacy. So to address this issue, I proposed the following research question. Why do foreign states use particular influence strategies to affect national security policymaking in the United States, and how effective are these strategies? So just to give a quick roadmap, I'll be talking a bit about my methodology, how I conduct this research, and providing some background on the JCPOA and the policy debate around it. Then, after revealing some of my primary findings, I'll go into depth on the first empirical chapter of my thesis in order to give everyone a sense of what my research entailed before concluding the presentation. So in order to answer this question, I looked at a single high-profile case and utilized a process tracing approach. The primary method for data collection that I utilized were 40 different interviews with various experts on the topic, including former White House officials, current and former Senate and House staffers, think tankers, journalists who had covered the issue, as well as different advocates on both sides. And these interviews were, without a doubt, the most exhilarating and enriching aspect of the entire project, and really allowed me to gain a fascinating level of nuance and insight that I certainly would not have been privy to otherwise. That being said, I did look at public data as well, including secondary reporting, public statements, and filings from the Foreign Agents Registration Act database, which I'll preview for you all a little bit later. And my task was essentially twofold. to chart out the influence strategies through a descriptive and analytical approach towards the empirical facts, and then to tackle the issue of efficacy through evaluation of 4 different hypotheses, which I'll discuss in just a moment. So this right here is the theoretical framework that I bring to this project, a 2x2 matrix of different pathways to influencing policy. As I'll discuss a bit later, a state's influence strategy may include up to all 4 different pathways, direct and indirect lobbying, as well as direct and indirect information operations to seek to affect policymaking. And for each country that I examine, I use this framework, and I'll be returning to it a number of times throughout this presentation. As you can see, what distinguishes direct from indirect is whether or not the state itself is engaged in the influence activity, or if it's a domestic actor or proxy doing it on that state's behalf. The difference between lobbying and information operations has to do with sort of the type of influence, whether you're seeking to directly advocate for a given policy or more subtly trying to create the information environment in which your interests are more likely to be met. If we're talking about the Saudis, for example, it's essentially the difference between lobbying and public relations. As for the second question, the question of efficacy, I propose the following hypotheses. 1, foreign influence determines outcomes in American political decision-making. 2, foreign influence plays no role in American political decision-making. 3, foreign influence can play an important role in shaping the cost calculus of American political decision-making. And 4, the efficacy of foreign influence varies depending on the strategy used by the state. And we have represented here the 2 extremes of how individuals may think of foreign influence, as well as a couple of hypotheses that lay somewhere more in the middle. So let's talk about the JCPOA, better known as the Iran nuclear deal. For our purposes, the excruciating details of enrichment levels, centrifuges, etc., aren't as important for our understanding, but essentially the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was an international agreement between the P5+1 and Iran to limit the scope of Iran's nuclear program. This was done because the international community was concerned about the intentions of Iran's nuclear program, and many believe that they're on the precipice of developing a nuclear weapon at this time, as well as a desire on the part of the newly elected moderate Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, to secure relief from some of these international sanctions and hopefully enact an economic revival for his country. The important thing to know is that while it was generally supported within the international community, it was a politically controversial agreement in both the US and Iran, while facing significant opposition from both Israel and Saudi Arabia. So my thesis examines the influence strategies of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran over the course of these 5 years in relation to the issue of the JCPOA. And in order to bring analytical clarity to the case I'm looking at, I broke these 5 years under examination into smaller distinct periods, as you can see for yourself here on this slide. Importantly, each of these periods were characterized by different political and structural factors. The negotiation period was a relatively diffuse policy debate featuring several potential targets of foreign influence. The congressional review period immediately after featured a 2-month-long lobbying campaign focused squarely on Congress. And then there's also the year and a half, the first year and a half of the Trump administration that I've termed the withdrawal period, wherein the administration slowly works its way towards a complete withdrawal from the agreement in May of 2018. And as I mentioned before, I'll just be discussing the first period in depth today, but I'm happy to talk about the other 2 if there are questions. So before I dive into that first period, let's preview some key findings. Overall, I argue that influence strategy choice is driven primarily by structural factors, as I'll expand upon with respect to each state. And on efficacy, I find that my last 2 hypotheses, 3 and 4, are most substantiated. Foreign influence plays an important role in shaping the costs around political decision-making, and efficacy varies considerably by strategy. So then let's talk about the first period, the negotiation period. After the election of Hassan Rouhani in Iran, the opportunity for a diplomatic solution to Iran's nuclear program expands dramatically, and diplomatic outreach between the US and Iran begins immediately. Within months, we see the conclusion of an interim agreement called the Joint Plan of Action, JPOA, that halts Iranian enrichment in exchange for some moderate sanctions relief while setting the table for further negotiations. These negotiations continue for roughly a year and a half. They're extended a couple of times, and as the P5+1 near an agreement with Iran, some important events take place that I'll get into a bit more in just a moment. So Israel ends up being the most high-profile opponent, foreign opponent of the JCPOA, ultimately waging a highly contentious battle against the administration in concert with the Republican Party over this issue. And this opposition is driven by a number of factors, including Israel's regional rivalry with Iran and the latter's support for Hezbollah and Hamas, as well as the latent Israeli fear of Iran potentially developing a nuclear weapon, and Prime Minister Netanyahu's own domestic political considerations. Netanyahu is a politician who derives much of his electoral standing in Israel from casting himself as a sort of bulwark against various security threats. And Iran was perhaps the most prominent of these threats. And he had a domestic political incentive then to talk up the threat of Iran, potentially even beyond much of what the Israeli security establishment's assessments were at the time. In terms of constraints, Israel faces quite few and arguably has the most latitude of any country to seek to affect policymaking. Most Americans view Israel quite favorably, and there's a large constituency of both American Jews and evangelical Christian Zionists who are supportive of Israel's security priorities. Most importantly, there are a variety of institutions in Washington that significantly amplify the influence of Israel over policymaking, including AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is generally regarded as the most powerful foreign policy lobbying group in Washington. But they also include major think tanks, such as the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Both of these organizations were founded either by AIPAC members or for the purpose of supporting Israeli interests with respect to US Middle East policy. And they do carry a considerable influence over this policy. So what was their strategy? Well, I argue that Israeli strategy during this period was really all-encompassing, but primarily constituted a campaign centered on public appeals against diplomacy while encouraging tighter sanctions on Iran both directly and through AIPAC. Immediately after Rouhani's election, Netanyahu describes him as a wolf in sheep's clothing and begins to publicly press the case that nothing had fundamentally changed in Iran. This imposed significant narrative costs on the Obama administration, dragging what could have been a story of diplomatic triumph into a constant back and forth in which the Obama administration had to argue that they weren't, in fact, imperiling Israel's existence. Most notably, Netanyahu gave a speech against the nuclear agreement before a joint session of Congress, largely behind the administration's back, which was seen at the time as a profound overstepping of diplomatic boundaries. And as many who were privy to the thinking of Democratic members of Congress at this time that I had the chance to speak to, the speech arguably backfired since it solidified Democratic support for the president's diplomatic effort. Domestically, AIPAC mobilized heavily in encouraging further sanctions against Iran, a move that almost certainly would have derailed the negotiations at that point. And as many of the House and Senate staffers I spoke to discussed, AIPAC is often involved in the drafting of this legislation and is highly prolific in terms of proposing different ideas, circulating text, and having their voice heard on these issues. One senior aide to a Democratic senator who supported these sanctions described the relationship between AIPAC and domestic opponents of diplomacy in Congress as symbiotic. And we also know from reporting on NSA intelligence that the prime minister himself, Netanyahu, was heavily involved in coordinating with American Jewish groups to mobilize against the eventual JCPOA. And so here we see the Israeli influence matrix in full, which I've mostly just discussed. And in the interest of time, I won't be sort of running through it in detail, but I'm happy to talk more about this later on. So let's talk about Saudi Arabia then. The Saudis were also opponents of diplomacy with Iran, but less out of specific concerns about the particulars of the agreement being negotiated and more over a fear of being the loser in a wider American withdrawal from the region. President Obama famously says during this period that Saudi Arabia will have to learn to share the region with Iran, and this type of rhetoric is quite frightening for the Saudis, who are engaged in a number of proxy wars with Iran around the region. It's actually during this period in March of 2015 that the Saudi campaign in Yemen begins as part of a more assertive Saudi foreign policy in the shadow of this agreement. And unlike Israel, however, Saudi Arabia faces a lot of constraints. Their one asset, as is true generally of Saudi Arabia, is significant financial resources at their disposal. And yet, having a multi-million-dollar lobbying campaign only goes so far. This type of lobbying is not received necessarily as warmly as APAC lobbying is. And this has much to do with my first point, which is that people really don't like Saudi Arabia that much for a variety of reasons, despite this country being an important security partner of the United States at kind of the executive level. And so this has ramifications both for lobbying and for public information operations. So then what was the Saudi influence strategy? Well, through combing through supplemental statements filed by various lobbying firms under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, I did find some evidence of anti-Iran lobbying. And we have an example here on this slide of sort of what a FAR disclosure looks like. You can certainly glean some information from it, but not a ton. But we can see that the Saudis did lobby, presumably in favor of Iran sanctions in late 2013. And this was the same sanctions bill supported by APAC that was thought to be sort of deleterious to the ongoing diplomatic effort. However, it doesn't continue for very long. And as confirmed by nearly all of the House, Senate, and White House staffers I spoke to about this period, the Saudis were not especially high-profile opponents of the JCPOA, despite their known opposition to the agreement. And this is really because of the aforementioned public perception constraints imposed upon them. Thus, the Saudis kept their concerns private, out of public view, and mainly kept them at the executive level. And importantly, this did impose some costs on the Obama administration, including the need to sort of host a summit at Camp David, where the administration reaffirmed the relationship between the US and the rest of the Gulf countries, as well as making some further security concessions then as well. However, this wasn't nearly the same level of cost as that imposed by Israel. And furthermore, as I argue in the thesis, the Saudis likely tacitly relied on Israel-aligned influence efforts during this period, allowing them to do the fighting as the Saudis kept their powder dry. And this is an idea expressed by many of the individuals I had the opportunity to interview and is consistent with what we know about Israeli-Saudi cooperation on intelligence and security, as well as engagements between Israelis and Emiratis during this period. Lastly, let's talk Iran. Iran had relatively straightforward priorities, securing sanctions relief while simultaneously making sure not to capitulate too much towards the Great Satan, as the US is commonly known within Iranian narratives. Moderates like Rouhani had to do a somewhat delicate dance between conducting outreach to the West while not appearing weak or even as a sellout back home in Iran. And unlike Israel and Saudi Arabia, Iran is uniquely incapable when it comes to foreign influence. Like Saudi Arabia, they're generally disliked by the American public, but by virtue of the fact that they lack diplomatic relations with the US, they lack the ability to lobby. And so they have very little to work with, but they do use what they have quite well. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif is arguably Iran's most powerful asset, being a longtime diplomat at the UN, generally well-liked in American policymaking circles, as well as with the cultural fluency, as one of my interviewees described it, to engage with American society and argue Iran's case in a palatable manner. Additionally, there were potential proxy organizations in the US, such as NIAC and the Iran Project, through which different arguments and priorities that Iranians had could be made known to the American policymaking community. And so the Iranian strategy here focuses primarily on public diplomacy, a direct information operation, which was important for signaling to the Obama administration a willingness to engage in diplomacy. Half of this was simply drawing a contrast with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was Iran's previous president. And whereas Ahmadinejad was famous for calling the Holocaust into question, Zarif tweets Happy Rosh Hashanah in September of 2013. And it's sort of small things like this that kind of set off a frenzy in US media and ultimately signaled to the administration and to the wider American society that a different government is now in power in Iran. And these public diplomacy efforts have an important downstream effect, which is lowering the costs for both the administration and for a coalition of pro-diplomacy organizations known as the Plowshares Coalition to engage in lobbying and public campaigns in the US in favor of the deal. One of the most prominent organizations within this coalition was J Street, which is a progressive pro-Israel advocacy group. And as one of their senior executives told me, it very much was the moderation signaled by both Rouhani and Zarif that gave an organization like theirs the political space to push for the JCPOA in a way that they wouldn't have had Ahmadinejad still been in power. And so this is Iran's rather unique influence matrix, wherein they weren't able to directly lobby at all, but were able to effectively utilize charm offensives and indirect reliance on progressive American organizations to realize their goals. And let's talk about findings. So as I previewed before, I find that my research most supports my last two hypotheses, that foreign influence plays an important role in shaping the cost calculus of decision-making, and that the efficacy varies significantly depending on the strategy. And specifically, we observe that Israel imposed significant costs upon the administration as they sought to reach an agreement with Iran, forcing them to expend important political capital on fending off bipartisan sanctions legislation in Congress that could have derailed negotiations. At the same time, Iran's public outreach was successful in shifting the costs of domestic groups and the administration in a direction favorable to their interests. And lastly, Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned before, was frankly quite limited by virtue of the structural elements at play. They were going against an American administration, something they didn't want to do because of the security support that the US provides to them. But as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia was able to be somewhat assuaged by an American recommitment to their priorities. And frankly, US support for the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen begins during this period, wherein the US backs this proxy war against Iran in order to secure Saudi acquiescence to the JCPOA. So in conclusion, I believe the primary contributions of my research are a workable framework to examine foreign influence, as well as hopefully an encouragement of more nuanced discussions around the phenomenon of foreign influence. Additionally, I think my research shows the need for tighter and perhaps more extensive enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, as that's a perennial issue in Washington, as well as the need for, I think, greater attention to the elite level influence efforts that take place. I mean, we talk a lot about Facebook ads and Russian influence campaigns, but there's a lot going on in Washington that doesn't necessarily get as much airtime. So in closing, I'd like to thank Professor Ziegart and Ewing for running an incredible program this year. Coming to seminar was one of the highlights of my week. I'd also like to thank my thesis advisor, Professor Call, for all the help that you've given me this year as I embarked upon researching this topic. I also deeply appreciate your help in facilitating so many of my interviews. This thesis wouldn't have been what it was without them. And lastly, thank you, Dr. Muir, for being a fantastic resource and source of encouragement, and for answering all the dumb and obvious questions I was too afraid to ask any professors. And with that, I'm now open for questions.
Great, so applause for Bryan, nice job. So if you can, thank you, unshare your slides. We'll turn first to Dr. Call.
Great. Thanks, Bryan. As you know, I think your project is super interesting, and I thought your presentation was fantastic. You covered a lot of terrain in very, very efficiently. I guess I wanted to hone in on one of the trickiest parts about your thesis, which is essentially what you find is that, or what you argue, is that influence campaigns serve as kind of intervening variables. That is, they are not the primary cause of something, nor are they irrelevant. Instead, they intervene in the process to affect the costs, and therefore either the probabilities of outcomes or maybe the sustainability of those outcomes because of the costs that they impose. So there's nothing wrong with focusing on intervening variables. I'm a big fan. But I wonder, two kind of questions associated with that. One is, how do you think about measuring the incremental impact of an intervening variable like this toward an outcome? In other words, in each of your cases, right, essentially the administration's preferences determine the outcome, right? Or they got the outcome matched their preferences. So how do you what types of measurements do you think are most persuasive in demonstrating the incremental effect on influence campaigns, even though essentially administrations ended up getting what they wanted? And related to that is a second question, which is, as a mental exercise, what types of counterfactuals have you found useful in kind of imagining a world in which the influence campaigns didn't exist, and how the outcome therefore might have been different?
Definitely. Thank you for both of those questions. So on the first question about measuring the incremental impact, you're definitely right in that this was something that was, I think, especially challenging to me in the initial months of carrying out this project, because I remember our conversations about this being, well, how do you measure efficacy? How do you measure efficacy? And I think what I sort of settled on in the end was the sort of four hypothesis setup in which you're able to sort of make the claim that there are costs imposed, but you're right in that it's hard to sort of quantify. I think if I were to go back in time and do a project that's more sort of quantitative or focusing on sort of how you can measure this on the margins, I think I would try to do a close analysis looking at Congress and looking at the sort of vote counts for different resolutions that say maybe APAC would have supported. One of my interviewees made the point to me that, you know, APAC doesn't determine what gets passed in Congress, but that they do do a lot to sort of increase the margins on a lot of these things and make sure that they're bipartisan and make sure that they kind of sail through without significant opposition, which of course in turn contributes to their long-term political durability. And so I think I would look at vote counts on that. And then there was sort of a second part of your question too, which was sort of how do I think about this in terms of the administration usually kind of getting its way on this. And particularly looking at the first two periods of my thesis, the negotiation period and the review period, I really, towards the end, started thinking about this in terms of political capital. I think, obviously, the Obama administration eventually got what it wanted in terms of the JCPOA, although perhaps it could have gotten more had there been foreign support, particularly from Netanyahu for this agreement. And, you know, I think it was really hard for them to get it done, whereas it didn't have to be, right? Like this wasn't a significant political dogfight in the UK or in Germany or in any of the other P5+1 countries. It was in the US because of both partisan dynamics and because of, I would argue, some foreign influence. And so I think that, yeah, political capital is the primary way in which I think about that. And then to your question about counterfactuals, again, referring back to Netanyahu, I think that had he been supportive of the agreement, or not even supportive, had he just sort of perhaps done the same thing that the Saudis did, which was sort of express their disappointment, sort of let the administration know that they didn't like it, but not mobilize Jewish groups in the US against it, not mobilize AIPAC against it, you would have seen, I think we would have still had the JCPOA in place today. And so, but at the same time, there's an interesting counter argument in that perhaps Netanyahu's opposition helped secure Iranian agreement to the JCPOA. So it's a very complicated thing, but I think a lot of people point to, well, what if the Israelis had just done what the Saudis had done and sort of been angry about it, but not done much about it? And I think you probably would have seen the JCPOA still in place today.
Okay, so we have a queue for questions. I want to remind everyone watching, if you want to ask a question, just type it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen or in the chat function. So our first question from the class is Elena.
Great presentation, Bryan. I really enjoyed it. My question is around your findings and how they were reliant on an evaluation of the goals and interests of the states that you were considering. And in light of perhaps a lack of sources in those immediate governments, how comfortable did you feel with your suggestions of the goals and interests involved?
Definitely, and thank you for your question. I think that, you know, that sort of was always going to be a limitation of this project, and that, you know, and I was never going to be able to speak to President Rouhani or Prime Minister Netanyahu or the Saudi Crown Prince themselves, although I would have liked to, had that been possible. And so I think my remedy for that issue was to try to dig as much into the public reporting at the time, try to get a sense of what different people thought the motivations of those different actors were, and kind of draw my own conclusions based on that. Additionally, a number of my interviewees, while obviously not being the actors themselves, were certainly privy to the thinking of, in particular, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Foreign Minister Zarif. And so, yeah, I would say it was a limitation, but I ultimately feel comfortable with the judgments that I made about sort of what the goals were of each country. just as one might when they do any sort of political spectating, where they might sort of speculate about what President Trump's goals are with regard to something, or what ex-politicians' goals are with regard to something.
Okay, I'm going to go to, we had an early question from our audience from Reed Polly, who said, great project, Bryan. You briefly alluded to security concessions that the Obama administration made to Saudi Arabia. What kind of evidence did you find of a change in US policy regarding the Saudi war in Yemen? And I'm going to add to that, which is, can you say more about what security concessions you think were made, just more generally?
Certainly. So there's essentially two parts to this. The first is a very public summit that takes place at Camp David, actually 5 years ago today, May 14th of 2015, wherein Obama invites these 6 different countries from the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, to Camp David, and essentially reaffirms the US commitment to the security of these countries. And this includes a lot of kind of minor things like increasing military cooperation, sort of talks about more security agreements in the future, that sort of thing. The purposes of that were really to kind of send a signal to those countries and other countries around the region that the US would be remaining committed to their security, and that they weren't, in fact, getting abandoned. In terms of actual security concessions, I would argue that US support for the war in Yemen would not have taken the shape that it did had there not been this sort of latent nervousness about, on the part of the Saudis, about US withdrawal from the region. I mean, there's, I think, a solid argument to be made that the Saudi campaign in Yemen isn't necessarily within US interests. It's not something that directly has to do with US assets in the region. It's more to do with a ongoing proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so the kind of support that the US gives to this campaign is obviously support in terms of weapons, logistical support, those sorts of things. And I think you probably would have seen more of an effort to rein in some of the excesses of this war, particularly earlier on, had the political dynamics of the JCPOA, the regional dynamics, not sort of made that the most expedient thing to do.
Okay, next we have a question from Andrew.
Thank you, Bryan, for a really fascinating presentation. I wonder if you could describe a little bit, I'm curious if you noticed any differences in the influence strategies that were used towards the 2 presidential administrations. So first with the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And did you see any differences in the strategies that were employed?
Definitely. Yes, the short answer is yes. You know, it was interesting. I recently wrote my chapter on the Trump administration, and I mean, the whole landscape of politics and regional politics as well was quite different during that period. And so by virtue of some of the personnel in the Trump administration, as well as the relationship that Trump had with Prime Minister, or has with Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as with sort of the Christian Zionist evangelical base of the Republican Party, you obviously see a much tighter relationship between the Trump administration and Israel that I think plays a very significant role in leading to the withdrawal from the agreement. You also see a tighter relationship with the administration and the Saudis, which has both to do with wider the wider priorities of the Trump administration, aligning more with the Saudis, but it also has to do with all sorts of interesting and unconventional connections, such as the relationship between Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman. And so those are kind of 2 major differences. And then on Iran, I mean, it's really like night and day, where, I mean, we can talk about Iran having some limited influence during particularly the negotiation period. That completely evaporates under Trump. And, you know, all of the same assets remain in place. I mean, Zarif remains a very active Twitter user, someone who engages with American media relatively often, but we really see quite starkly how much that doesn't matter when the administration isn't receptive to their message.
Okay, so we have a bunch more questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. This question comes from Morgan Kaplan, Bryan, and he said, great project. I'm curious about what lessons you learned from how to do elite interviews. How did you identify the right sources? And more importantly, how did you determine whether they were providing accurate information?
Definitely. It's a fascinating question. I would say that I definitely learned a lot from giving my first interview, which was nerve-wracking. I remember preparing for a couple hours for it, versus some of my final ones where, you know, I would only need to spend maybe half an hour just sort of researching the person. I think in terms of preparation for these interviews, I would make sure that I knew as much as I possibly could about them and their positions with respect to the issue, so that I would know when they made a particular argument, oh, this is in line with what sort of anti-JCPOA people might say about this. This is more in line with what pro-JCPOA people might say about this. And I don't know, it's hard to say, I think, how you develop your own kind of judgment on these issues, but I would like to think that I did. I mean, it was really just kind of, as a side note, fascinating to interview so many different people who were, you know, on separate sides of what was a really highly contentious issue. And, you know, the things that some of my interviewees would say about one another was a really sort of interesting side aspect of the project. And I sort of had to learn to just sort of laugh along and well, privately thinking to myself, like, did you really just say that? So yeah, I think it was just sort of a trial by error, learning by experience sort of thing.
So next, going back to the class, Antigone has a question for you.
So first of all, congratulations, Bryan, and thank you for a really interesting presentation. You, following Andrew's sort of line of questioning, I'm wondering whether you would anticipate that Israel, for example, would be more inclined to pursue sort of very public-facing foreign influence versus maybe back-channel foreign influence in a scenario where it's in better or worse relations with the administration. So do you anticipate that a foreign power which is maintaining sort of warm relations with the American administration would be more or less inclined to pursue a public campaign against something?
Definitely. I think it's somewhat difficult to answer given that the sample size is kind of small. I mean, namely, it's two administrations. I would say that the public nature of Israeli influence generally is a constant. You have, you know, Netanyahu continuing to speak very publicly about how bad Iran is, even under the Trump administration. The difference is that Trump agrees, and it is saying much of the same things. And so I think it's a different type of thing when you have an administration that's largely in agreement with you. You continue to do everything that you do publicly, but you're not having to wage a campaign against the administration in the way that Netanyahu did against the Obama administration. And I would say that, you know, there hasn't been a major example of Netanyahu and Trump differing in terms of regional issues or issues pertaining to Israel in particular, at least not that we've seen publicly. But my guess would be that there really haven't been any generally. And so, yeah, I would say, short answer, that it's always kind of public, but at the same time, it's difficult to know, at least from my perspective, having just sort of two administrations to look at.
So Bryan, this question from the audience from Chase Small actually builds really nicely on Antigone's question, which is asking about the generalizability of your framework. Mm-hmm. So how do you think about the generalizability of, in general, are indirect strategies more effective? Are direct strategies more effective? Under what contingent circumstances do you find one more that tends to be more effective than another? Definitely.
I think that direct influence with a direct lobbying and information campaigns, when you're working with a constituency, an administration, a Congress, etc., that is favorable to your interests, is obviously going to be sort of the most effective influence campaign. In the absence of that, indirect, say an indirect lobbying and information campaign against, say, the Obama administration by Israel and interests aligned with them in the US is going to be more effective. I mean, something that I wrote in my thesis at one point is that the most effective foreign influence is that which is not necessarily foreign at all. I mean, the thing about AIPAC is that it isn't a foreign lobbying organization. It's an organization of Americans, primarily American Jews, but also there are plenty of non-Jews in AIPAC as well, who are committed to Israeli security priorities. And because of the domestic nature of their organization, they have a lot more leeway, both sort of normatively speaking and legally speaking, to operate within the American political system and advance the interests of Israel in a way that is often, often there is some daylight between, or not often, but sometimes there is some daylight between the government in Israel and AIPAC, but not often. And so it's really an effective proxy for foreign influence in that way.
Great. So we have a question from Raleigh Brown, which is about elites versus masses and how that relationship works in the target country of foreign influence. So Raleigh is asking, how much is effective foreign lobbying reliant on the elites' embrace of lobbyist perspectives? Do you see public opinion or politician signaling as the key mechanism of effective foreign lobbying, or are they somehow symbiotic?
Definitely. I think the short answer is that they're both important, but that their relative importance varies depending on the structural factors at play. And it's unfortunate that I only have 20 minutes to talk about this because, I mean, that's sort of one thing that varies significantly across my chapters, particularly the negotiation chapter versus the review chapter. The negotiation chapter, while there is congressional action, most of it is relatively low profile, at least low profile in the sense that, the average American on the street isn't going to know what's going on. But the elite policymaking community is certainly well aware of it. And so I think in that instance, yes, it is much more of an elite phenomenon, and what's going on at the elite level matters much more. What's kind of unique about this period is that there's this 2-month review period after the conclusion of the JCPOA in July of 2015, where there's a nationwide campaign, both in favor and against the JCPOA. And obviously in this case, this is where the opinions of the masses do matter because they're lobbying their representatives. I mean, as kind of an interesting side note, I was actually interning for my own member of Congress during the August recess of 2015. And I remember taking a lot of calls related to the Iran deal. And so that was a period where mass targeting in terms of influence campaigns was highly important, and it was the actors that were most capable of doing that, namely the Obama administration, pro-diplomacy domestic groups, as well as groups aligned with Israel, that were able to have the most effect in that case.
We've got the stop sign from Espandiar right at the top of my Brady Bunch screen. So everybody join me in thanking Bryan for a great presentation, great discussion.
Thank you.
Okay, we are going to move on to Andrew. Andrew Lokay is a senior, obviously majoring in international relations and French. He grew up in Fairfax, Virginia. At Stanford, he's done a number of different things, including serving as an IR peer advisor, an academic theme associate in Crothers Hall, and doing student outreach for the Haas Center for Public Service. After graduation, he's interested in a career in public service, and he has 2 advisors, Dr. Anna Jamawa-Busa and Dr. Joe Felter. Andrew.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Good afternoon. Today I'll be presenting my senior honors thesis titled The Repatriation Dilemma, European Countries and Islamic State Foreign Terrorist Fighters. By foreign terrorist fighter, or FTF, I mean an individual from one country who traveled to another country to fight for a terrorist group. Between 2013 and 2019, over 52,000 people from around the world went to Syria to join the Islamic State. 12,000 were Europeans. Since the territorial defeat of IS in early 2019, the Syrian Democratic Forces, a Kurdish-led militia, has detained thousands of ISIS fighters, including an estimated 1,200 Europeans. As shown by this tweet from President Trump, the United States has urged European countries to repatriate their foreign fighters from the overcrowded, poorly supplied prisons and detention camps in Syria. The United States is asking Britain, France, Germany, and other European allies to take back over 800 ISIS fighters to be captured in Syria and put them on trial. Some countries have complied with this request, such as Kosovo, and taken back their foreign fighters from Syria. Others, such as the United Kingdom, have refused repatriation and have even stripped the citizenship of foreign fighters as a way to prevent their return. This variation in responses leads to my research question. Why have some European countries repatriated foreign fighters while others have not? This map displays the variation in foreign fighter repatriation policies across Europe. In dark blue are the countries that have fully repatriated their citizens from Syria: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, and North Macedonia. In the medium blue are the countries that have partially repatriated, taking back some of their citizens, often women, but not all of them. In light blue are the countries that have generally not taken any of their citizens back from Syria. As you can see, most European countries have refused repatriation. My thesis has three major findings. First, I argue that if a country is a NATO aspirant, it is more likely to repatriate. Second, I find that a higher Muslim population is associated with repatriation, but does not fully explain it. And third, I argue that evidentiary challenges in building cases against returned foreign fighters may lead countries to refuse repatriation. Here's the roadmap for the rest of my presentation. First, I'll discuss my research methodology. Then I'll go over my literature review and the 4 hypotheses that I develop. After that, I'll present some evidence from my cross-national analysis and my case study of the UK. And finally, I'll conclude with some implications for scholarship and policy. I arrive at my results via a nested analysis. This means that I start with a cross-national medium N analysis of 16 European countries, and then I focus in on 2 countries, the United Kingdom and North Macedonia, for case studies. I'll just be discussing the UK during this talk, but I'm happy to address North Macedonia in Q&A if anyone has questions. The literature suggests several potential explanations for the variation in foreign fighter repatriation. First, European countries might be concerned about the security threat potentially posed by foreign fighters returning to the homeland. These are battle-hardened members of IS. Second, countries that seek to maintain a strong relationship with the United States, such as NATO aspirants, have a strong incentive to cooperate when the US makes a request, such as President Trump's tweet. Third, political pressure from domestic audiences may influence foreign policy decisions, such as foreign fighter repatriation. And finally, foreign fighters make for complicated legal cases. Are all countries' legal systems of sufficient quality for this task? Based on the literature, I develop 4 hypotheses. First, if a country has a greater history of jihadist terrorist attacks on the homeland, then it will be less likely to repatriate and vice versa. Second, if a country is a NATO aspirant, it will be more likely to repatriate. Third, if anti-Muslim views are more prevalent among a country's population, then that country will be less likely to repatriate and vice versa. And fourth, if a country has a higher quality legal system for counterterrorism, then that country will be more likely to repatriate and vice versa. Before testing these hypotheses, I'd like to review some initial findings. First, I find no correlation between the number of foreign fighters who departed for Syria and a country's willingness to repatriate. As you can see here, the 3 countries with the most foreign fighters, North Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo, fully repatriated them. Second, I look at the share of a country's population that's Muslim. While there's an association between a higher Muslim population and foreign terrorist fighter repatriation, as you can see here, the 3 fully repatriating countries have over 1/3 of their population Muslim: North Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo, there is not a direct one-to-one association in all cases, making this an insufficient explanation on its own. Albania, which is over 80% Muslim, has refused all repatriation, as you can see in the bottom right of this graph. Moving on to my first hypothesis, the history of jihadist terrorist attacks. One might expect a country that suffers more jihadist attacks per capita to refuse foreign fighter repatriation, but the evidence does not support this hypothesis. As you can see on this graph, the line of best fit is nearly flat. Many countries with very few attacks per capita, as you can see in the bottom left of the graph, have refused repatriation, while the country with the highest number of attacks per capita, Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the top right, has fully repatriated. Next, I consider NATO aspirations. The data supports this hypothesis. As you can see from the highlighted box in the top right of this chart, all the NATO aspirants in my study have repatriated fully, and the only countries that have fully repatriated are NATO aspirants. I'd also like to note that Albania, the only majority Muslim NATO member in my sample, and thus not a NATO aspirant, is the only country with a high Muslim population that did not repatriate, as you can see in the bottom left box. Next, I consider the prevalence of anti-Muslim views. The data does not strongly support this hypothesis. As you can see from this graph, the points are everywhere. There does not appear to be a correlation between foreign fighter repatriation and the level of anti-Muslim views in a country, according to data from the European Values Study. The line of best fit has a slightly positive slope, where if this hypothesis were to offer a very convincing explanation, we would expect a negative slope. Fourth, I consider the quality of a country's legal system for counterterrorism. I code counterterrorism legal quality as low, moderate, or high based on my evaluation of the analysis in the State Department's country reports on terrorism. As you can see from the graph, many countries with high quality legal systems, over here in the third group of bars, have refused repatriation, shown by the light blue color of the bar, or have only partially repatriated, as shown by the medium blue. The moderate and low quality legal systems are split between total and minimal repatriation. If under this hypothesis, one would expect the countries with the highest quality systems to repatriate and the countries with the lowest quality systems to resist repatriation, which is not what occurs here. To summarize my findings so far, I found that NATO aspirants are more likely to repatriate their foreign fighters, even more so than countries with larger Muslim populations. Yet I did not find support for the other three hypotheses, which leaves us wondering what explains non-repatriation of foreign fighters. To address this question, I turn to my case study of the United Kingdom. First, I will show that none of the other three hypotheses convincingly explain the UK's decision to not repatriate its foreign fighters. Then I'll propose a new explanation based on evidence from this case study. Though the UK has been a frequent victim of jihadist terrorist attacks in recent years, evidence suggests that security concerns are not the primary motivation for declining repatriation. The UK has a means of safely bringing back its nationals affiliated with IS known as Temporary Exclusion Orders, or TEOs. Contrary to their name, temporary exclusion orders are a way to facilitate the return of terrorism suspects. Subjects of a TEO must fly back to the UK under a pre-approved itinerary, must check in regularly with police, participate in programs to disengage with radical ideology, and keep law enforcement abreast of their whereabouts at all times. The British government has internally concluded that TEOs are effective in managing the security risk of returnees, yet has not widely applied the TEO regime in the case of Syria. If security concerns were the primary motivation for refusing repatriation, one would expect the UK to use this tool to reduce the dangers of returning foreign fighters. This has largely not occurred. Next, I turn to the domestic political pressure hypothesis. First, the UK's level of Islamophobia, according to the European Values Study, is relatively low, about 12%. Second, the issue of foreign fighter repatriation may not be highly politically salient. The UK held a general election in December 2019, after several years of successive jihadist attacks, including an incident near London Bridge several weeks before the election itself. Yet the major parties did not discuss foreign fighter repatriation or non-repatriation in their platforms, though they did address terrorism in other ways, mainly through the lens of crime and crime prevention. The major parties' silence on repatriation suggests that it may not have been an issue with great political salience. If it were, one might perhaps expect the Conservatives to claim that they were keeping the country safe with their policy of non-repatriation, but this did not occur. Finally, I turn to legal system quality. The UK possesses a very high quality legal system for counterterrorism, as you can see from this graph. Here I compare terrorism convictions in dark orange to all terrorism prosecutions in light orange. The conviction rate for terrorism trials in the UK is about 90%. Having found that none of these explanations are convincing for non-repatriation of foreign fighters, I propose a new one through this case study that is based on evidentiary challenges. Returned foreign fighters are hard to prosecute. This graph compares the number of returnees who have been prosecuted, in dark orange, to the total number of British foreign fighters who returned home of their own accord before the territorial defeat of IS in 2019, depicted in light orange. Only about 10% were prosecuted. The UK has not released figures on the verdicts of these 40 prosecutions, so we don't know how many were acquitted, but my research indicates that as few as 6 of 40 may have been convicted. Why is the UK's record so poor for returned foreign fighters when it is so effective at terrorism trials generally? I argue that the answer lies in evidentiary challenges. First, it is difficult to obtain admissible evidence for use in court against returned foreign fighters based on their conduct in Syria. Unable to adequately meet the legal system's high requirements for evidence, cautious prosecutors will bring charges of lesser offenses or none at all. The UK fears that foreign fighters, once repatriated, will go free because they cannot be prosecuted at home. Why is admissible evidence so difficult to obtain? First, while it may seem obvious that travel to Syria during this period indicates that an individual must have joined the Islamic State, this is not sufficient to bring criminal charges in the UK legal system. Prosecutors are left with 2 major sources of evidence. First, battlefield evidence, such as IED forensics, directly testifies to foreign fighters' actions in theater, but is difficult to routinely collect, catalog, and match to individual suspects in the chaos of a war zone. An alternative is digital evidence, such as photos, videos, or social media posts, which is especially relevant given the Islamic State's extensive use of propaganda. This evidence is not a panacea to the problem, however, and it may not always reach the criminal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. For example, in 2014 and 2015, British prosecutors possessed a wealth of digital evidence against a foreign fighter, including photographs of him posing with Islamic State child soldiers and a video of him handling severed heads. Yet instead of charging this individual with a crime relating to combat, prosecutors indicted him for lesser charges, including preparation for terrorism, because the evidence did not directly prove that he fought for IS on the front lines, only that he posed for these photos and videos. Even in a best case scenario, when it seems like a slam dunk evidence of wrongdoing, it can be hard to meet evidentiary requirements. This challenge applies to the foreign fighters detained today, including ELSHEIKH and ALEXANDA, 2 British members of a cell of British foreign fighters known as the Beatles. This is the group that filmed beheadings of Western hostages, including American journalist James Foley, in 2014 and 2015. Twice in 2016 and in 2018, the Crown Prosecution Service and the UK Attorney General determined that there was insufficient evidence to try these men in Britain. Consequently, the UK allowed the United States to take custody of the men for trial in the United States. The fact that the case against these men, whose crimes were so well publicized and well known, did not meet evidentiary standards suggests this problem may be worse for foreign fighters who did not commit such well-publicized crimes. Moving on to my conclusion. In this thesis, I tested several potential explanations for the variation in foreign fighter repatriation among European countries. First, I found that NATO aspirants are more likely to repatriate. Their desire for a good relationship with the United States provides an overriding incentive to cooperate on the issue of repatriation. Second, I found that a higher Muslim population, while associated with repatriation, does not fully explain it. While all of the full repatriation countries were Muslim, several countries partially repatriated did not have very high Muslim populations, and one of the countries with the highest Muslim majority, Albania, did not repatriate at all. Finally, I argue that evidentiary challenges in building cases against returned foreign fighters may lead countries to refuse repatriation, as shown by the UK. This finding can also explain cases of partial repatriation, as countries may choose to only take back some of their citizens who joined IS if they don't plan to charge them, the ones they take back. For example, this is common in cases of women, or if they happen to have a strong evidentiary case against particular individuals. My work has several key implications for counterterrorism scholarship. First, I begin to answer a question that has gone largely unaddressed by the literature to this point. Why have some European countries repatriated their Islamic State foreign terrorist fighters while others have not? And I arrive at several answers. Second, I contribute a new data set of foreign terrorist fighter repatriation policies of European countries. And finally, my thesis offers a useful direction for future research. I suggest that future studies of the foreign fighter problem and repatriation should focus on evidentiary challenges and these other legal issues. Next, some implications for policy. I think my thesis is quite policy relevant. First, I reaffirm that it is crucial to collect evidence against terrorists in combat zones, as doing so offers the potential to make it easier to prosecute foreign fighters and repatriate them. The United States, for example, with partnerships between the FBI and Joint Special Operations Command, has made great strides in this regard. However, with the US reducing its role in Syria and the Middle East, the international community has a strong interest in ensuring that evidence collection continues in the conflict zone. In addition, I suggest that it may not be realistic for the United States to continue expecting foreign fighter repatriation. First, we've run out of NATO aspirants at this point, and the remaining countries face issues with building cases based on evidence. As a result, policymakers should recognize that the short-term detention of foreign fighters in Syria may end up lasting for the long term, and should invest more heavily in improving the security and supplies of the prisons there. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone whose support was instrumental for my thesis project. First, thank you to my advisors, Professor GB and Dr. Felter. Your feedback sharpened my thinking and strengthened my writing. My project would not be the same without you. Second, I'd like to thank the CSAC teaching team, Professor Ziegert, Professor Ewing, and Dr. Meir. Your guidance and our weekly seminar have made me a better researcher. And finally, I'd like to thank all of my peers in the honors cohort whose feedback and encouragement helped me out along the way. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Well done, Andrew. If you can unshare your slides, terrific. So let's turn first, you know you're a special advisor when you go by your initials, Dr. GB. Dr. Jamil Abusa, to you first. You have to unmute.
The usual problem. So Andrew, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and a really great thesis. So it was a pleasure to read in its draft form at least. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the domestic reasons to repatriate, whether there are any, right? Is there any, you were just talking a lot about some of the reasons why the US might want the fighters to be repatriated, but is there any domestic constituency, any sort of domestic pull factors that might explain the patterns that you've been looking at?
Yeah, so I think there are a few domestic arguments. For example, Jeremy Corbyn has spoken out, you know, questioning the government's policy and suggesting that it might be better to repatriate for reasons of human rights, concerns about the loss of citizenship and people becoming stateless. So I think there's an argument sort of based on humanitarian issues to not leave these people in the desert. But I think for many publics, those don't resonate very strongly, given that these are people who in many cases turned their backs on their countries to join this jihadist movement and committed a lot of very serious crimes, as we saw with the example of the Beatles. So apart from some movements sort of focused on the rights of detainees and in human rights constituencies, there's been some movement, more so in the cases of the women and the children than the male fighters themselves, though I argue in the introduction to my thesis, it's not, I don't think it's wise to consider the men and the women separately, because the Islamic State, by virtue of its proto-state project and the caliphate, really drew on women's support in the religious police, in indoctrination and education of youth. So I don't think it's quite as cut and dry to say, you know, these women and children need to be brought home because they're suffering in the prisons. So I think in my own reading the situation, I've seen a lot more opposition to bringing them back as opposed to people in favor of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next we have Andrew's other advisor, Dr. Joe Felter. Joe.
Great, thanks, Amy. Andrew, great presentation. Really enjoyed working with you all year. So anyone who's done research, we all know the frustrations of having a question you want to answer, but the data you want, but you have to go with the data you have. And I know we've worked through some of your hypotheses that were maybe a tough time to work on because of data limitations. But let's say, here's a broad question. Let's say hypothetically, my master's student, maybe someone in the NYP program, reads your thesis and gets really interested in your work. How would you inspire her to, to continue this research, and what would you recommend to her would be the best, the most promising next steps to take this research further? So maybe saying it a different way, if you had a little bit more time, where would this have gone? And where do you think you might have ended up if you could have spent more time on it, or if you could encourage someone else to continue this important research?
Absolutely. So I think there's two ways in which I would have really liked to have expanded this project given a high research budget and more time. First, I think it would be interesting to conduct more surveys across Europe to determine public opinion. There's been some surveys in certain countries, but the wording has varied considerably. And asking only about, do you want to repatriate children? Do you want to repatriate the male fighters? Many countries have not been polled at all. And so I think it would be valuable to get a better polling. I turn to levels of Islamophobia as sort of a substitute, assuming that a population that has more negative views of Muslims would be more predisposed to oppose bringing back these people, which I don't think is an inappropriate proxy to use. But I think more exact polling would be really interesting. And second, I think a really interesting avenue for expansion would be to look more at the evidentiary challenges. So I build that argument based on my case study of the UK, which I think in many can largely be generalized. Yet I think pursuing more specific evidence from other countries would strengthen that argument considerably. And so that's where I would advise this successor to go.
Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, Andrew, we have a bunch of questions for you from various people. So let me turn to Dr. Martha Crenshaw. And if Martha can't, oh, I see her unmuting now. Go ahead, Martha.
I'll even there. Okay, so what I was wondering, Andrew, I know your case study was the UK, but did you find some evidence that other countries such as France and Germany also confronted the same problems of inability to obtain evidence, meaning that it's a more general problem and indeed could be addressed on a, perhaps even on a regional level, on an EU level?
Yeah, so I was focused mainly on the UK. So in my conclusion, I'm working right now on expanding that argument to look at some other countries. So a lot of my argument comes from past legal cases in the UK, as well as the Crown Prosecution Service standards. But I would argue that every country faces similar evidentiary challenges. I don't think UK investigators are more likely to be able to find battlefield evidence than German investigators, for example. I think, however, different countries examine the problem in different ways. So for example, in my North Macedonia case study, I talk a little bit about how North Macedonia relies on plea agreements with terrorism suspects very heavily. And so if your practice is to, you don't need to worry about having enough evidence to convict them because you're sort of know you're going to do a plea agreement anyway, that issue is not as much of a concern. So I think that issue affects multiple countries, and I think international cooperation could help with it, but I don't have specific insights into the different legal systems.
Moving on to the next part of our counterterrorism dream team, a question from Brett McGurk.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for having me. And this is a great report. I don't want a couple things, 2 quick comments and then a question. I think you're a little modest in the relevancy of this, having dealt with this issue kind of very firsthand. I used to make the point that Zawahiri came out of an Egyptian prison, Baghdadi was in an American prison. The next Baghdadi is sitting in one of these facilities. I have no doubt about it, and nobody is really paying enough attention to this. Secondly, what I found in these capitals when I was in my role as a coalition, it wasn't just the risk of these guys coming back or resorting to terrorism, but the pull of someone on the block or in the mosque that lived in the caliphate, just the draw of that in terms of indoctrination and recruitment as ISIS recruits with this nostalgia for the caliphate days. So that's one reason why a lot of these capitals just don't want these guys coming back. The UK experience was a great case study, and that is very much attuned to what I used to find with their diplomats. So it's great to have your research kind of confirm that. I guess my question would be, in your interviews, did you find, I'm just curious because I have not been dealing with this in some time, a kind of fatigue on the issue? My sense is that everybody's kind of giving up. And I think you speak to that in your conclusions, that there's not enough resources being put into this. But did you find that there are creative ideas out there? I know the UN, there's a UN team that has a mandate in Iraq that doesn't go to Syria. Is there some creative thinking to try to get around this? Or did you find that what I sense, there's just kind of fatigue and this isn't really going in the direction we would want? But great job.
Thank you very much for your comments, for your question. I definitely agree that there's a lot of fatigue on the issue. I think a lot of people want to consider the Islamic State over, dealt with, defeated, gone, and we instead have this really lingering issue that's difficult to deal with because the countries don't want them back. The Syrian Democratic Forces lack an effective legal system of their own as a non-state actor. And European countries have made several attempts over the past year to find workarounds. So many countries transferred several of their detainees to Iraq to be prosecuted there and to get them out of the prisons in Syria. Last fall, a group of countries, EU countries, tried to negotiate with Iraq to take all of them wholesale, and that effort failed. I also think it raises a lot of questions relating to international legal obligations. There's been some reporting about the conditions in which Iraq is holding Islamic State prisoners and allegations of torture occurring there. So that raises some legal questions about transferring them. Some of the other solutions that these European countries have tried have also fizzled out. Several, including Austria and Sweden, have called for an international tribunal in the model of Rwanda or after the Yugoslav wars, which I think sounds really great in theory, but would require an immense amount of international cooperation to develop, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. I also don't see the leadership in Washington necessarily be very supportive because they've really emphasized a preference for this issue to be dealt with on the level of the nation state and often bilaterally. So I think it's really tough because it's a problem without an easy solution. And so that's why I suggest that policymakers may need to consider solutions that we don't like. For example, the default is that they're going to stay there in Syria. And if they're going to stay there long term, we may as well secure the prisons. They're overcrowded. There's been escapes. They're poorly supplied. As you mentioned, it's often considered to be a hotbed of radicalization. And so at a minimum, I think the United States should reinforce the prisons and increase the investment there to increase the security, because that, given any change in circumstances, I think the most likely outcome is that the indefinite detention will continue.
Okay, so, oh, it's Fondier is giving me the stop sign. We have a bunch more questions, which Andrew, I'll pull together to send to you so you can ponder them as you finish your thesis, since as everybody knows, the theses are not yet done. But thank you, everybody, and join me again in congratulating Andrew. Terrific job on your presentation. Okay, last but not least, our final CSAC honors presentation is by Adam Elliot, and it's very fitting that we turn to a bioengineering, biosecurity expert in this time of our pandemic honors seminar. Adam is majoring in bioengineering. He's from Matawan, New Jersey. At Stanford, among his activities, he's interned for the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and he's been a CSAC research assistant for biosecurity projects, including the avian flu. After graduation, he wants to work at the intersection between the technical and policy worlds and national security. I think it's fair to say it's a growing area of interest across the world. His advisors for the thesis are Dr. Megan Palmer and Dr. David Relman. Adam, over to you.
Hello, is my sound okay?
We can hear you.
All right, great. Thank you for the introduction, Professor Ziegert. Thank you all to everyone else for coming. My name is Adam Elliot, and today I'll present the findings from my thesis entitled Keeping Pace, Addressing Life Sciences Dual-Use Risk Across U.S. Government Agencies. The U.S. government invested over $60 billion in biology research in 2019. This money supports the development of pharmaceuticals, sustainable sources of energy and waste disposal, alternative forms of manufacturing, and even novel methods of data storage. Because bioresearch often involves the manipulation of organic material, the stuff that makes up life, nearly all biological experiments carry dual-use risk. Some bioresearch, such as research with enhanced pathogens, pose a greater risk to humanity and are categorized by the U.S. government as dual-use research of concern, or DURC. The U.S. government has policies in place to address risks from defined DURC, but there are some edge cases that contest the definition used to make the policy. In other words, experts may argue that certain experiments should be classified as DURC, even though they would not be considered DURC under the US policy. Recent trends in synthetic biology and bioengineering have made these edge cases more prevalent, as researchers work with novel biological constructs to push the cutting edge of biotechnology. Funding agencies have a lot of leverage for mitigating risk in experiments, and when these edge cases pop up, these agencies respond in different ways to address the security risks. My thesis focuses on these edge cases and attempts to answer the question, how and why do government agencies approach dual-use research of concern in different ways? For my methods, I broke the question down into first answering how agency response differed before exploring why they differed. For my dependent variable, I performed process tracing analysis to examine how two agencies, the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, responded when confronted with two contested DURC experiments, gene drives and virus engineering for pandemic preparedness. For this presentation, I'll be walking through only one of these case studies, gene drives. For my independent variable, I characterized agency history, culture, and structure for the NIH and DARPA. By comparing the agency analysis to the dependent variable outcomes, I attempted to provide an answer for the main drivers for variable styles of risk mitigation. I chose these variables because the NIH and DARPA are two research funding agencies in the US government, and there were fairly well characterized cases of both of them choosing to fund research in classes of experiments where experts disagreed on whether their risks constituted classification as DURC or not. I hope that my findings will convince you that the main driver of variable response is a difference in organizational structure that allows for different levels of expertise and deliberation, changing the options available for risk mitigation. For the rest of this presentation, I will first give more context on DIRC and the way the United States built a policy for addressing it through an illustrative edge case example. Next, I will present a more detailed case study of one experiment type to which both DARPA and the NIH responded to show the differences in their response. Then I will outline my 3 hypotheses and present my findings from the comparative organizational analysis to argue for one of these 3 hypotheses. Finally, I will summarize the academic contributions and discuss the policy implications of this work. The definition of DIRC spun out of an evolving definition of biosecurity in the 2000s. The 2 reports shown below, known as the Fink Report and the Lemon-Relman Report, made 2 major contributions to the eventual life sciences DIRC policy published in 2012. The Fink Report's most lasting contribution was the identification of 7 experiment types of concern for consideration in funding bioresearch. 2 years later, the Lemon-Relman Report expanded the definition of biosecurity from one focused wholly on bad actors and pursuing bioweapons to one that included well-intentioned researchers misusing biotechnology inadvertently. The backbone of the US DIRC policy today is 2 lists, one drawn from the Fink Report's 7 experiments and another list of 15 select agents. Inclusion of items from these lists in a research proposal to a funding agency should flag the experiment as DIRC and mobilize an additional agency response to weigh the risks and benefits of the research and to offer feedback on how to lower risk. Regulators rely on these lists to flag DIRC, but edge cases arise when the nature of the research arguably reaches the threshold for DIRC in spirit, but elements from the list that make up the policy do not appear in the experimental protocol in question, and therefore does not classify as DIRC. One illustrative example of an edge case began in 2011. 2 researchers independently submitted manuscripts for publication describing how to generate mammalian airborne transmissible H5N1, a mutation that would make avian influenza transmissible between mammals through the air. The mortality rate for H5N1 is about 60%, but naturally occurring H5N1 only passes from birds to humans and does not have the right characteristics that would allow it to transmit between humans. Experts were divided on this issue, with some arguing that studying mutations of this nature is imperative for detecting and responding to emerging pathogens, while some said that the research was too risky and that its publication could provide guidance for making a lethal bioweapon. The manuscripts were eventually published with edited protocol sections to address biosecurity concerns raised by the US government and the World Health Organization. In 2013, a string of biosafety failures in US government labs led to a renewed debate about this so-called gain-of-function research, and the White House imposed a moratorium on public funding until it could offer better guidance for funders. After 5 years, technical and ethical analyses, and iterations of policies to address the safety and security concerns, the NIH began funding the research again. This example shows that agencies have options for responding to contested DIRC. They can stop research, they can build new biosafety and biosecurity guidelines, they can encourage or create new types of research, or they can work closely with researchers to address risks as they arise. Now let's look more closely at one of my case studies in an edge case in gene drive research. Gene drives are a novel genome editing technique that could allow a researcher to spread a specific gene of interest with near 100% success, as opposed to a traditional gene inheritance pattern that would permit a maximum 50% chance of passing a new gene along to an offspring. This research has been mobilized heavily around invasive species and vector-borne diseases, where researchers are attempting to use gene drives to suppress mosquito populations that carry the malaria parasite. There are chances for unintentional misuse of this technology via unintentional spread, but experts also worry that gene drives could be misused to more effectively spread a vector-borne disease or deliver a pathogen that crashes crop yields. Through my case studies, I tried to characterize agency approach to contested DIRC using these 5 variables: the types of projects funded, key agency decision-making processes, considerations of risk for the agency, risk mitigation measures, and secrecy versus transparency. These variables are reflective of the choices agencies have in approaching contested DIRC experiments. I gathered information from publicly available government reports, public agency announcements, news articles, information on funded experiments, and a FOIA database of some correspondence between funders and researchers. And while I can't walk through each of these elements, I'll present here some of my findings that helped me to build out the differences in approach. To address gene drive risks, DARPA stood up the Safe Genes program under program manager Dr. Renee Wegson. In the early stages of planning the program, there was a small press uproar that DARPA was trying to weaponize the environment, which saw a swift and seemingly rare public statement from DARPA about the exclusively biodefense intentions for the project program. I found that there was frequent interaction between the DARPA teams and potential performers, and while I couldn't find evidence of a formalized non-disclosure agreement or classification, I was able to characterize a desire for discretion on DARPA's part until the official announcement of the teams funded for the Safe Genes program was released. The public NIH response around gene drives received far less press than DARPA's. In approaching gene drive risk, the NIH was the primary funder for an expert panel called the Committee on Gene Drive Research in Non-Human Organisms, which eventually led to the publication of the Gene Drives report shown here. This report offered guidance for building policy to address gene drives and discuss biosecurity concerns with respect to gene drives. While this panel effort received funding from a few sources, including DARPA, the publication of the report was funded by the NIH and its think tank, Foundations for the National Institutes of Health. The FNIH also published a roadmap for safely supporting gene drive research from the lab and into the field. I also collected data on all the funded gene drive experiments by both agencies in 2018. In all, I found that there were 19 known gene drive experiments funded, 8 funded by DARPA, 8 funded by the NIH, and 3 funded jointly by the 2 agencies. The data I collected points to the NIH's preference for basic research and incremental advance, as well as DARPA's preference for funding research that can operationalize these experiments for use in the field. This analysis captures the comparability of the funding agencies by showing that they likely could have funded the same experiments, and in some cases they even did, but the experiments they chose to fund overall reflect their difference in approach. As shown, 75% of the projects solely funded by DARPA had plans for release of the technology into the wild, while only 25% of the NIH-funded experiments did. Furthermore, 62% of the NIH-funded experiments were intended to further develop lab models, while none of the DARPA experiments made explicit claims of doing so. Through this process tracing both this case and the case for pandemic preparedness research, I was able to complete this comparison. I grouped the approach to funding into 2 different models: traditional peer review for the NIH and a technology trajectory steering model for DARPA. These different approaches have implications for what the agency does in deciding to fund contested DIRC research. To go along a few of these axes, I found that the NIH was more likely to fund basic research, while DARPA preferred applied biosecurity projects, which means that the experiments they funded often had technological security solutions embedded in them, like a self-exhausting gene drive or a gene drive intended to stop unintentional spread. Overall, while the NIH takes actions deliberately to fund basic research, to prioritize scientific legitimacy, and to enhance biosafety protocols, DARPA moves more quickly, interacts with researchers more frequently, focuses on projects with security solutions embedded, and is more responsive to recognize threats to the US military. Now let's move into my hypotheses and the characterization of my independent variable. To try to explain the difference in outcome, I propose the following 3 hypotheses for investigation when analyzing the agencies. First, I looked at bureaucratic incentives inside each organization, such as promotion incentives for championing risky research or showing biosecurity expertise. Second, I looked at agency mission relative to both the types of research funded and the risk mitigation strategies of each organization. Third, I analyzed organizational culture and structure, specifically focusing on the way the funder communicates with their fundees and the decision-making power of individuals inside each organization. There were many potential lines of inquiry, but I chose these hypotheses based on organizational comparison literature and because they all reflected obvious differences in the agencies for examination. I drew on academic research characterizing the NIH and DARPA and public information on agency websites to build out this section. I found minimal evidence for hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 and stronger evidence for hypothesis 3 about the difference in relationship between funder and fundee and the autonomy of a single person inside an agency. For hypothesis 1, I found that the NIH offers greater bureaucratic incentives, but there is little reward for funding risky research. At DARPA, I found very little bureaucratic incentive. DARPA has had 21 directors since 1958 with an average of a 2.9-year tenure. The current director of the NIH, Dr. Francis Collins, has held the position since 2009. He's the 16th director of the NIH in his 120-year history with an average tenure length of 7.2 years for NIH directors. Both agencies rely heavily on outside expert advice when making funding decisions with security implications, further limiting the incentive to become a security expert internally. But the expectation of expertise on the DARPA program manager should include knowledge of security risks of a technology. Lastly, realizing negative implications of a technology harm technological progress, whether the applications are biomedical or military, and whether these realizations are real or perceived. This overall trend in technological advance decreases incentive to approach experiment types because of the risk at both agencies. For hypothesis 2, which looks at the influence of mission, it showed that mission was a driver in the types of research each agency funded, but did not appear to have much bearing on the way that they elected to address security concerns in the research. While DARPA's mission has evolved over the years, it has remained centered around the task of building a better prepared military by avoiding technological surprise for us and creating it for our adversaries. NIH's mission, on the other hand, is centered around advancing our fundamental knowledge of living systems to promote human health. NIH also has a policy-making office, while DARPA does not. The NIH's policy office mission is to promote progress in the biomedical research enterprise through the development of sound and comprehensive policies. This does not offer much insight into the way that the NIH might approach a specific security problem. The missions reflect that agencies respond to security concerns when they have to, dependent on the kinds of research pursued to fit their overall mission. From analyzing agency structure and culture for the NIH and DARPA, I argue that hypothesis 3 is the most compelling driver for differences in response to the same risk. Overall, I found that both agency structures map onto the way that they assess risk and respond to risk through the models I identified in my case studies. At DARPA, program managers enter the agency as leading experts with a program in mind. They're given near total autonomy to create the program in line with their vision, but they only have 3 to 5 years to complete their project before leaving the agency. The NIH, on the other hand, operates with a peer review-based funding model where panels of experts rank proposals on scientific merit and funding is allocated down this list until the money runs out. It is very difficult for any one person to champion an idea or a specific protocol. Furthermore, DARPA funds through contracts while the NIH funds through grants. This means that DARPA can pull funding at any time, and this necessitates a close relationship between the person with their finger on the funds and the performer receiving the funds. This allows it to be much more nimble. This allows DARPA to be much more nimble in addressing biosecurity concerns as they arise. In fact, DARPA dropped one of their original gene drive performers in 2018 before their Safe Genes contract was supposed to end. The NIH peer review model, on the other hand, does not allow for the level of interaction seen at DARPA. Simply because there are too many grants and not a deep enough expertise in the review panels, this forces the NIH to deliberate on security policies before funding, opting for moratoria or deliberation to address fully the risks in proposals before deciding to fund them. Time frame, expertise level, and funder autonomy appear to be the strongest bounds on agencies in the ways that they can respond to DIRC issues in life sciences research. There are reams of past scholarship that compare agencies and bureaucracies. I attempt to offer an innovative approach for analyzing contemporary case studies to characterize the enactment of security policy as a funding agency. In my thesis, I parameterize risk mitigation options for funding agencies, and I offer a process tracing model for scientific research funders. Future projects around this topic may explore alternative hypotheses, such as the way agencies respond to external events, such as bioterrorist attacks or pandemics, or the way that agencies might respond to motivations based in a horizon scanning exercise. Another fruitful line of inquiry may build comparisons with more edge cases in biology or other fields with dual-use technologies. On the policy side, I hope that this thesis can bring attention to the need for updated biosecurity policies that would lead to a more predictable agency response to research in, quote, gray areas of risk, saving time and money. I also hope that it builds policymaker knowledge around contested DIRC experiments. I've characterized two approaches to funding scientific research. DARPA exhibits a more entrepreneurial, trajectory steering approach, while the NIH exhibits a more conservative, peer-reviewed funding approach. These differences have implications for how capable agencies are in addressing risks in scientific research and appear to be dependent on details of agency structure and culture. As applications of biology become more present in regular American life, it is important to understand the capacity of government agencies to address security concerns while fostering a fruitful future for biotechnology. This all focuses on risky research and how to approach risk when that risk is contested. And as long as the US seeks to lead the world in all forms of technologies, these problems are not going away. I would like to take this last moment to thank the wonderful teaching team, Professors Ziegert and Ewing and Dr. Meir, for teaching me more than I ever thought I would know about political science, as well as my two advisors, Professor David Relman and Dr. Megan Palmer, for your endless wisdom and expertise for the last year. Finally, to my friends, family, and my fellow cohort, thanks for your support, and more importantly, thanks for sticking around. And with that, I will take questions.
Well done, Adam. Okay, so first we're going to turn to Dr. Relman.
So Adam, I very much enjoyed your presentation. In the way that you formed your hypotheses, I think there's a huge amount of merit and value. Some might argue that there is overlap, that they're not entirely mutually exclusive, that, for example, mission in some ways might dictate or lead to culture and structure. But I certainly want to make clear that Adam's conclusion is his own, and it happens to be one with which I do agree. But it leads me to wonder if you could somehow to discount or avoid the sort of the impositions or the constraints posed by history, and you were to create new institutions today, or a new institution today, to address this need, you know, the most effective way to address dual-use research, what would be the features of this new institution? Where might it borrow from, and what might be the ways in which you would sort of draw from your analysis and kind of describe that new institution?
Yeah, through my research, I started to sort of realize which approaches worked well in certain scenarios and which approaches worked well in others. I guess to pull from the DARPA model, it would make sense to have a deep expert when this new agency is confronted with the kind of risk in a gray area, just because it's important to have expertise on the ground and have this person who can frequently communicate with researchers. But for more well-characterized risks, I think that an approach like that at the NIH works well and would not waste lots of time and money, or, you know, we wouldn't be trying to reinvent the wheel every time that we had to mitigate risk in an experimental protocol. So I think DARPA model, yeah, you know, this is my own claim, but it may be better at addressing new emerging risks, just because of the tightness between the funders and the researchers and the decision makers and the researchers, while elements of the NIH approach are better at addressing more well-characterized risks.
Okay. Thanks.
Dr. Palmer.
Great, wonderful. First, I just wanted to say what a joy it's been to work with Adam, and I always really enjoy seeing, you know, students who are working in one discipline in bioengineering here, and then really taking on a challenging topic of how to quickly learn and apply new methods that might be most appropriate to the questions, right, that have been nagging them. So, you know, short brief in learning political science and then applying it to a complex set of contemporary case studies. So first, you know, congratulations on that front, and great to see this work. I wanted to draw a little bit on what David was saying and your response to the first question here. You had a really descriptive analysis that I think was useful in coming up with different categories of risk mitigation measures. and then looking at why those agencies might have taken different approaches. If you were then to go into a sort of evaluative mode and then try to assess the effectiveness of those measures over time, if you had built your new institution, how might you begin to approach that? What are the types of things you might have found through your work that would give indications of the signals of what effectiveness might mean? And then second question related to this is, for the types of, in your second category, or your second case study with pandemic pathogens, where the risk might be a little bit more imaginable in some ways, were there any differences in those two approaches?
So for the first question, which asks to measure the effectiveness, well, I think one place to look immediately is the amount of time and the amount of money and the amount of people that go into addressing an emerging security or an emerging biosecurity issue for the institution. On the researcher side, I think I'm adding into this institution. It's now required to, enhance researcher awareness of biosecurity issues. I think it's important to survey what are researcher motivations and what are researcher what is a researcher's ability to identify risk in their experiments, because oftentimes it's these security issues are flagged by researchers and they emerge out of discussions within the research community. So I think some way to track researcher awareness would point towards effectiveness. And your second question, which, correct me if I'm wrong, was there a different strategy in my second case study?
Yeah, did you notice any differences in the way that risks were perceived or characterized, or the approaches that were deemed suitable, either within NIH or DARPA, looking at potential pandemic pathogens versus gene drive work?
Yeah, I would say, I'll comment on the NIH side. There was much more, definitely much louder press about funding experiments or funding dangerous experiments. The U.S. government is funding dangerous experiments that they don't want us to know about, and the illustrative example that I included in my presentation was also part of this case study, and the moratorium is a pretty big policy tool that the U.S. government used in order to address the risk and to build out policies for guidance, which we didn't really see in the gene drug case.
Okay, Adam, we have a question from Susie Emerson, who asks a question that I think a lot of people want to know the answer to, which is, how do you think the current pandemic will change the public and political opinion on the importance of new security policy regarding risky science?
Let's see, I have to be careful here. I invite Professor Relman and Dr. Palmer to chime in if I'm straying. I think, right now, it's finding out if the virus leaks from a lab is not the most important thing at the moment, because at this point it does not matter until it's time to, if there ever is a time to assign blame, that's when it should be more important. But on the flip side of that, there's also, because it doesn't matter, it is, and these kinds of lab accidents could lead to global pandemics. I hope that there is significant mobilization around biosafety and biosecurity policies I think a few years ago, there was a CSAC honors thesis written about how the US government and possibly other governments around the world build out biosecurity policies in response to events like epidemics, pandemics, or terrorist attacks. And a lot of the U.S. DIRC policy building got into motion after the anthrax letters were mailed in 2001. So I hope that there will be significant mobilization around biosafety and biosecurity policies, and a pretty deep review of just how capable we are of performing research that could lead to an emerging pathogen.
So I want to take the moderator's prerogative of asking a couple of very unfair questions, Adam. So one is, I'm going to ask you about all the organizations you didn't write about or study in your honors thesis. So you've done this great comparison of NIH and DARPA and how these two agencies approach one challenge in very different ways. Can you put into context a little bit about how those agencies compare to, say, universities or non-governmental agencies, and how they think about the governance of these kinds of technologies? And then broadening the aperture a little bit more, how do US government agencies operate relative to other national government agencies in other countries? Are we ahead? Are we behind? Is there global consensus about these kinds of things? Can you sketch us a broader picture of the US governance perspective of DIRC and then the international perspective?
Sure. In 2014, the NIH released guidelines for institutions to I guess do their part in identifying and addressing DIRC risks, and I assume that these institutions include universities. In the private sector, when it's purely privately funded, it's hard to enforce these kinds of mitigation strategies because they're usually tied to public funding. I know, I mean, it largely exists on norms, but I could cite one example of private companies coming together to agree on a set of rules for how they will create their biotech products. Is, I don't remember the acronym, but it's the IGFC, and it's a consortium of companies that will mail you samples of DNA, and they get together and they agree that they will perform a certain screening process and not mail DNA that could be misused or could be made into a lethal pathogen or a harmful pathogen. Internationally, it varies very much. There's not much consensus. There are a number of experiments and like policy experiments in different countries to see what is most effective. I believe that the EU operates more on a case-by-case basis for addressing DIRC research, while the US relies on lists. At the international level, I got to work at the WHO last summer, and even there's some mobilization on norms, and I got to work on a project where we were considering the establishment of a global registry for gene drive research. So before a research team embarks on gene drive research, they will go into this registry and list their motivations and what they plan for the research, just so that there's some enforcement or accountability mechanism, at least by their fellow researchers.
So we only have a minute left and we have two questions. So I'm going to ask one, then I'll turn to Elena to ask the final question, then you get to wrap us up. Adam. So Beth Cameron is asking, apropos what you just talked about with the WHO, what do you think the role of the WHO should be in oversight of DIRC and synthesis of pandemic pathogens like SARS-CoV-2? P.S. she writes, I am so proud of you, Adam. So that's Beth Cameron's question. And then Elena, let's turn it over to you. You can ask your question and then we'll let Adam respond.
Fantastic job. As you mentioned throughout the presentation, your hypotheses and research drew from a variety of disciplines. So to ask a very broad question, I'm curious what you learned about communicating risk across disciplines throughout the project.
Okay. So thank you, Beth. Thank you for coming also. What do I think the WHO should do? I'm among a cadre of students that I might not make strong claims on what I think is the role of international organizations moving forward and or treaties. But I do think that the WHO plays an important role as a platform for concrete norms, concrete global norms for biosecurity policies and for, exploring the questions of should there be red lines in research? How might we hold countries accountable for performing research that lots of other countries, or maybe it's the WHO consensus, that they don't think should ever be performed. I think the WHO is a great model for international organizations moving forward because there's not a huge enforcement mechanism, and they largely operate on norms and guidance. And just given the nature of scientific research and its requirement to be so flexible, I think it's much more important to rely on norms. So I hope that answers your question. What did I learn about communicating risk between disciplines? It's very challenging. I'll remember our trip to DC in September, where Eva and I sat around most of the roundtables and brought up questions about biology, and either got shrugged off or just a flat out I have no idea. I can't comment on it. But it's now at the forefront of people's minds, more so than it was in September. So I think there has to be a willingness to listen to people like me, but I think it's still important, but it's hard. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
So you're welcome now, Eva and Adam, to come back to Honors College, where they will pay more attention to you in September. I have a feeling that everyone will pay much more attention to what biologists have to say from now for the immediate, indefinite future. So this concludes our honors thesis presentations, but it doesn't conclude the honors theses. So the class will continue to get together. We will have our virtual honors commencement celebration on Saturday, June 13th at 10 a.m. But all of you watching, I hope you join me in congratulating all 11 of our honors students on a tremendous job, not only with their research throughout the year and the thesis presentations that they've given, but what they're about to finish in the next couple of weeks. Congratulations to all of you guys. Well done. That concludes our class for today. We'll see you, I hope, at commencement.